Welcome to the Governance Podcast from the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society. My name's Mark Pennington and I'm the Director of the Centre here at King's College London. As part of our current project on the political economy of knowledge and ignorance, we're looking at the relationship between power and knowledge production. In conditions where there may be uncertainty about the nature of truth, then who gets to decide what truth is, or who gets to police the truth, and what are the effects on people from this policing? These are, of course, concerns that were central to the work of the French social theorist Michel Foucault. One of the domains of governance where these issues are particularly salient today is that of digital governance, and in particular content moderation on various digital platforms. So I'm very pleased that we have with us today Professor Terry Flew, all the way from the University of Sydney in Australia, where he's the Professor of Digital Communication and Culture. Terry is the author of numerous articles and books, the most recent of which is Digital Platform Regulation, Global Perspectives on Internet Governance. Terry, it's great to have you with us here today at the Centre and at King's. So I wonder if we could start off with you just telling us a little bit about yourself. How did you get interested in this whole area of digital communications and governance of the internet?
Well, first of all, Mark, thanks very much for inviting me to be here. And it's wonderful to be at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society and to be with the Department of Political Economy. My own background is in political economy, where I did my bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Sydney, including doing my bachelor's with the current Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese. So my interest, so I've always had an interest in, I guess, the political economy of knowledge. And as someone who went from the University of Sydney to one of the newer universities in Australia, the University of Technology, found that those institutions are very strong in the communications field. So communications, journalism, media studies, film, those very much the areas of those universities of technology in particular. And at both the UTS and then subsequently at the Queensland University of Technology, I was very involved in developing the media programs. And of course, the nature of the media program shifted quite significantly from about the mid to late 1990s, and they increasingly came to be about the internet. And there, I guess we found that the question of what were the differences and what were the similarities between digital communication and other forms of communication continues to pervade the sector. That I think in the early discussions around the internet, the view was it was all radically different. You had to throw out the old rule books. We were in a new world. And over time, that perception of the digital has, I think, declined, which is not to deny there are some very significant differences. But I think the idea that everything to do with the digital is unprecedented is a harder position to hold. And I had the opportunity in 2011, I was invited by the then Australian government to chair a review of the National Classification System, which is all of the various forms of media content classification, including internet governance. And of course, the complexities raised by internet governance for this field are very, very considerable. And in that case, a lot of the old ways of doing things are actually very hard to pursue in the new environment. At the same time, the underlying questions, principles, debates have parallels over time, and I think it's there that we can start to trace how some of these things around content moderation, internet governance, which always seem like completely new questions, nonetheless have certain historic antecedents. And I had the good fortune to identify the French philosopher Michel Foucault as someone who potentially has something quite interesting to say in this space.
Well, let's come on to Foucault in a minute, but before we get into that, I wonder if we just going back to what you were saying there about your own background, saying that you actually have a background in political economy, because what strikes me as being quite strange is how there's relatively little, in my experience, interdisciplinary connection between people who do political economy, especially economics, the economic side of it, and the field of culture, media, communications, that sort of thing. I mean, do you have any sense of why that is from your own experience? Is it just that they work with different concepts, or?
Well, fields like media economics are quite small in the economics discipline, and having co-authored a book on media economics. I'm aware that a lot of economists don't feel that that's real economics.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. Yeah. At the same time, the whole field of the economics of information, if you like, I'm thinking about Fritz Machlup, I'm thinking about Daniel Bell, that whole tradition, Hayek, is there. I think your comments about, you know, the economics of knowledge, but also the economics of ignorance are there as well. And I think, or at least I'd hope, that with some loosening of the very strict regime of the neoclassical paradigm, which people certainly learnt in the 1980s, and the introduction of behavioural and experimental approaches and so forth, those questions of how people come to make decisions are increasingly important. As a side issue, I would say that at QUT I was very involved in developing courses around creative industries, and creative industries provided an interesting point of intersection between culture, knowledge, information on the one hand, and industry, markets, economy on the other.
Well, it's really interesting you say this, because I just did a podcast actually a couple of days ago with Diane Coyle, and you know, she was talking about how the idea of network effects, which is something that is a significant concept in economics, is absolutely relevant to this whole question of platforms, the digital world. But there aren't actually that many economists who've really sort of taken it up and run with it to think through, well, what does this mean in terms of the way we think about the way particular markets are configured, what kind of rules might be relevant to them. So it's good to know that you're in this space.
Yeah, and there are others doing it. I think, for instance, Richard Caves the Harvard economist, wrote one of the first books on creative industries, and he came at it from the perspective of institutional economics, and there was a lot of insights there into the nature of contracts, what's known as the Hollywood model, and how it extends out more widely. I think there's quite a bit of, I've found quite a bit of fruitful intersection in those spaces myself.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned in your opening remarks there that you have this interest in Foucault. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what made you start to make connections between Foucault's work and this kind of space about thinking about the internet and how it's governed?
I would say it's the combination of two things. The first has always been a sense, and I certainly got this when I did the work for the Law Reform Commission, that the binary opposition around censorship versus freedom didn't seem quite right, and there's a lot of debates we can have as to the nature of freedom, and there'll be more to be said about that. But the idea that freedom and constraint are these kind of absolute states on polar opposites didn't seem quite right. And Foucault is someone who talks about the production of freedom and the consumption of freedom and so on. I also became interested in the concept of neoliberalism. Because there'd be those who would say that anyone talking about, the economics of culture and so on, this is the neoliberalisation of culture, or the reduction of intrinsic value to commodification in the market and so forth. And typically, Foucault was cited in that light. But when you actually go and read Foucault on neoliberalism, it's a lot less clear cut than that account would suggest. He's certainly not just saying it's the dominant ideology of late capitalism or something like that. And in fact, he's quite interested in the ideas of those who would come to take the role of neoliberals, whether it be the German auto-liberals or the American Chicago School and so on. And I think that was interesting. So the intersection of those points I found interest here.
I mean, the area where I find his ideas interesting in this sense is how we've had a sort of transformation from maybe the early age of the internet, where people spoke about it almost as though it was this new realm of freedom, a kind of anarchic realm. And over time, it's become progressively governed, but it's become governed in sort of different ways. And Foucault has that very interesting notion of governmentality, where you've got this intersection between sovereign rule, which is sort of direct commands, but then also you've got discipline, where you've got sort of people being judged against norms, and then you've got his ideas about sort of security mechanisms or biopower, where there's government going on, but it's at a kind of at a distance through various sort of mechanisms that encourage monitoring and this sort of thing. So if you think about the way the internet has gone from this kind of anarchic realm to this governed space, all those different dimensions seem to be involved when we think about the issues of content moderation or whatever it may be. Is that a fair take on it?
Yeah, I mean, governance practices have always been patchy. Even at I think the height of the notion that the internet and globalization would, transform everything. There was about a third of the world where that didn't apply, and people would say, "Oh, of course, China's an exception." Well, it's a pretty big exception, and it's become a bigger exception over time. And I think also there's if you like been a sort of three-way movement. I talk about a three-way movement in the history of the internet, that you have the open internet, but you have the rise of platforms as that offer a way of managing the open internet. So you could track, for instance, the move from blogging to Facebook is an interesting case in point here, and the way that they order and organise and enable social media, the way that Google allows for search without having to remember HTTP, whatever. And all this. And so as consumers, we buy into a platform bargain, but that means that what we call the internet or the global network is increasingly something that's governed and managed by private entities, and that means that there's a kind of a visibility to governance, and governance questions have always been around. One of my favourite early instances is the court case that the French government took up against Yahoo in 2000 around the selling of Nazi memorabilia on the Yahoo France site. And this pointed to the tensions between a global platform on the one hand and national jurisdiction on the other. And those tensions have continued to play out. And indeed, I think we're in a current environment where we've had this platformisation of the internet, but we've also had regulators, legislators, civil society organisations feel increasingly emboldened around the expectation that something needs to be done around the issues of concern raised with the platformised internet, whether they be competition policy issues or content issues or public shocks or privacy issues and so on. So we have a lot of regulatory activism in this space at the moment that is playing out differently from one country to the next. But I think it's significant that this is coming from the liberal democracies. So the idea that you had this polarity between the liberal democracies and the open internet on the one hand and the authoritarian states and the governed internet on the other, well, it's much more mixed up.
Well, there's certainly, I'm not sure what it was like in Australia, but certainly here during the pandemic, there were a lot of concern raised by some of the groups who were, shall we say, sceptical of the lockdown measures, that they were being censored in terms of what they could say, in terms of things being taken down on YouTube, and then, stories coming out that basically that was almost done in cahoots with the administrations. I mean, so that sounds like the kind of thing that the caricature would be. This is what goes on in China, but actually,
yeah. Well, it's a shift in the way that we think about censorship. That the classic model of censorship would be something like the Lady Chatterley's lover trial, where a whole range of measures follow from the debates that got a hearing in that trial around the importance of context, artistic merit, etc., and more generally the question of too much government interference in what were felt to be matters of personal choice. So that form of censorship has been declining over time, and it's always had certain paradoxical effects, like certainly in Australia, nothing raises the profile of otherwise obscure films than the government trying to ban them. It's a version of the Streisand effect. So people go off and see a film for fear that it might otherwise be banned, and so you have that sort of classification regime that replaces that. But you have what the Yale legal scholar Jack Balkin refers to now as the free speech triangle. Whereas the traditional censorship debate has been the state versus the individual. You now have a third entity in this, which is these private actors who can order and arrange speech. And their practices are a lot more obscure than those of government agencies. And so they constantly face around whether they're over-blocking on the one hand, whether they're insufficiently blocking on the other. These overlay with, partisan political debates, and there's all sorts of things going on, but they are acting in this sort of quasi-governmental manner, but without the sort of institutional legitimacy that whether or not you agree with the policies of the government of the day, there is understanding as to why they're the government of the day. But these are quasi-sovereign entities without that underlying legitimacy.
So if we think about, again, going back to Foucault about this, if we think that the internet is becoming this governed space, whether by these private agencies or sort of connections between them and governments, do we connect that to some kind of overarching discourse about the way in which people understand what the internet is for and the kind of activities that are going on there? Is it through some kind of narrative that is out there that people have come to see this as a space that ought to be governed in some way or other, or that it is in fact being governed in ways that they hadn't maybe previously thought about?
Well, people are not the only agents in this space. So advertisers are a very important entity here, and the history of copyright on the internet has told us that platforms can always moderate content if they wish, and I think it was the House of Commons inquiry in the wake of the Joe Cox murder where in the final report they pointed out the speed with which YouTube could remove copyright infringing content as compared to the relative slowness with which content that could be seen to be promoting violence would be dealt with on the platform. And the platforms are very sensitive to that. They're also the advertisers are very conscious of what sits alongside their brand. So advertisers are a stakeholder in this, politicians are a stakeholder in this, various civil society organisations are stakeholders in all of this. It's not an easy life for a platform, and these are these are decisions that are being made typically in very rapid fire fashion.
But if we think about, so you say when we think about the governance here, there's the issue that there might be too little content moderation, but also the concern that there might be too much. If we take the concern that there may be too little, it's again maybe trying to connect it to this notion of a sort of a discourse that's out there. And it seems to me that area has been affected by concerns about anxieties about, say, what children are doing on the internet, what they're being exposed to. There are also anxieties about terrorism. Is the internet a space where terrorist groups can... So those are kind of anxieties about, is the internet a kind of safe space in the sense of the things that are going on there? And that seems to be the kind of concern about there being not enough content moderation. Would that be accurate?
That's right. That harms... I think if you would say there's, in the first stage, freedom of speech discourses dominate. There's some wonderful... if you look at the striking down of the Communications Decency Act in 1997 in the US Supreme Court, and some of the literature on that, I think Mike Godwin, who we had the phrase Godwin's Law, to observe, give people a modem, a computer, and access to a network, and they're more likely to do good than do harm. That's an emblematic statement of the era, and insofar as they promote mistruth, other voices will come forth, will counteract that. Now, that flips. And increasingly, discourses around the potential for harm become more and more important, and they're different. They're different to the traditional focus of censorship. I mean, what happened to sex? We're not, we don't talk about sex anymore. We talk about, body image, children feeling peer pressure, online harassment, a variety of misinformation, a variety of harm discourses have come to be more important, and those, obviously bring regulators and legislators to the fore much more, whereas I think in the first, probably up to the sort of mid to late 2000s, internet policy tended to be more about faster broadband or computers in schools or getting people on the internet. The concerns about what was...
It was people not having enough access to
Not having enough access. Now the concern is too much access. So in the state in which I live, mobile phones are going to be confiscated in schools. That's...
Because people are spending too much of their time looking at screens.
That's right. Yeah, so those sort of discourses.
Yeah. So if we go to the other side then, so the concern that there's too much governance, I guess the area there that's the obvious one to speak about would be the idea that these are now platforms that could be censoring speech. Or that people got to conceive the internet as a kind of public square, but it's actually a public square that's controlled by these private entities, either in pursuing their own interests or pursuing their interests in cahoots potentially with public authorities. So could you say a little bit about that side of it, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I think part of the concern here is just not knowing
what is going
what's going on, and also what's the basis on which decisions are being made. And I think a very interesting moment in this has been the initiative of now Meta to create an oversight board of eminent jurists, public figures, human rights lawyers, and so forth, to provide a platform to adjudicate on their own decisions. And this partly responds to the sense that the platform company is both the administrator and the judge of the content on its own platform, and the obvious conflict of interest issues that raises. At the same time, it is an attempt to keep governments at bay. So there's a kind of one phrase that I've come across with regards to this is actual constitutionalism, and this is private entities creating quasi-legal frameworks. And if you look at how the oversight board operates, it has the apparatus of a court. It's intended to create case law, have legal precedent, and so on.
Is the sense that these organisations are doing this because it's kind of what they want to do, or is it because they feel there's a kind of implicit threat that if you don't do this, we will do it for you? The government or official regulators will do this instead.
Both.
It's both.
Both. So it's partly a company like Facebook or Meta dealing with the recurring concerns about its platform, and Cambridge Analytica probably being the tipping point there. It's partly about trying to derive competitive advantage from this, from organisations that have the money. So the sort of money that's involved with the oversight board is considerable. It's US 130 million in a trust, held in trust. It can't be taken back by the company.
That's just for the oversight board.
That's just for the oversight board. So this is a serious investment funds, and potentially creates barriers to entry for their competitors. But it is also the sense that governments are certainly signalling an intention to act in this space. So after years of the major tech companies basically refusing to appear before the US Congress, in 2018 Mark Zuckerberg does appear before the US Congress, and it's been a steady stream of appearances from all of the tech companies before legislators all around the world, and this sense that they are in a slightly defensive posture. And that they want to manage the terms of their own regulation, if I was to put it that way, whether that be through these kind of quasi self-regulatory entities, but not self-regulatory in the sense that the advertising industry or whatever have had these self-regulatory codes, which widely critiqued as toothless tigers. But these more innovative approaches to that, but also there's also the point that they are global companies, and to the extent that national laws start to come into play that differentiate what happens in one jurisdiction from what happens in another, this creates real transaction costs for a global platform.
You also, I was thinking when you were speaking there about, given this kind of implicit from governments that some form of regulation is required, you then also get this nexus where, I mean, in the case of Facebook or now Meta, they actually hired Nick Clegg, who was the former British Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister,
who advised Zuckerberg that he needed to create something like the oversight board to get on top of this situation. Yeah, so Clegg, and also, when we know this from going back to the Snowden revelations about the NSA in the US, there are deep connections between the tech companies and state agencies. We can't get away from it.
So how are we supposed to think about the famous event of this last few months or year, I guess, is the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter? How do we sort of conceptualize that in this space?
Well, it could be the best or worst corporate takeover in history. It's certainly been a wild ride. It has also gone against the grain of what was generally happening in the platform environment, which would be to say platforms were establishing monopoly or quasi-monopoly positions in key digital markets. This created the expectation that something needed to be done, and there's been work bringing Karl Polanyi's work to mind here in the same way there was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the double movement. And the tech companies want to, be seen as good corporate citizens, stakeholder capitalism, and so on. So they respond to these measures, albeit on their own terms. But then what Musk does with Twitter is quite different, and it's going to be, I think, it will be very interesting to see how it plays out in Europe, because he's effectively stripped back the capacity to regulate the platform, which is going to present issues in demonstrating compliance with, say, the Digital Services Act. So, but it's a move. I mean, don't get too far into what the psychology of business leaders that world, but it's not an obviously great business decision. I use Square, which Jack Dorsey was the co-founder of, and I think how much simpler it must be to run a payments management company than it is to run a social media company, and probably more profitable. So I think that there's something else driving the Musk moment there with Twitter, and it's been interesting because it's happening almost in the face of a very large part of the user base who.
Well, I mean, if we thinking about the economics of this, one way I was thinking about it would be, I mean, what model of competition should we be thinking about when we're thinking about these platforms? So, I mean, going back to the earlier conversation, it seems like a sort of neoclassical model of a kind of quasi-perfect competition isn't really relevant in this kind of space. But you could say that a kind of Schumpeterian model of competition is relevant. So what people are competing on in this case is not identical products, but they are differentiating quite clearly. And what you could say he's trying to do here is differentiate Twitter as a less regulated space, or as a different form of regulation to what's going on in some of these other platforms. So it's a kind of differentiation that is being tried.
It is, but that's a crowded space. That you have Gab, you have Parler, you have a variety of
doing similar things.
So-called free speech platforms. And what tends to happen is that it's too small. It's too much of an echo chamber. It's not.
It doesn't have a network effect.
It doesn't have a network effect at all. So this people then tend to come back to Twitter, come back to Facebook, and so on. And real political campaign budgets are going to spend on the large platforms. So there are definitely ways that you differentiate the social media experience. So in the wake of the takeover, there was a surge of interest in Mastodon.
Yeah.
And this idea of the Fediverse. Now, I talk about being reminded about the difference between sort of Silicon Valley culture and European engineering culture. Mastodon. I found it unusable. I found I either stayed within my own little centre of the Fediverse, in which case I kept hearing from the same few people who I heard from on each other platform, who were kind of evangelists for Mastodon, or I was thrown into a completely disorganised maelstrom of things I couldn't comprehend. So I guess that reminds you that platformisation is not all bad. Having someone curate the experience for you has its positive sides. But over time, there is certainly that potential for very different social media experiences. And from the point of view of from the perspective of advertisers, I think we can underestimate the extent to which there currently exists a buyer's market for advertisers. From their point of view, and I've heard industry people talk about this, okay, Facebook's got 2.7 billion users, but Yahoo, which everyone assumes is all but dead, has 300 million.
Yeah, I think that's incredible.
And if they're offering, if they're offering a rate that's less than 10% of what Facebook's offering, that might be a reasonable spend, because they all overclaim on the precision of their targeting, and the move. It's also estimated that people are on an average of 7.5 platforms. So, and people have different experiences on them. So what you post on LinkedIn wouldn't be what you post on Twitter, wouldn't be what you don't post a picture of your lunch on LinkedIn, and you don't go off into a rant on LinkedIn,
I wish people would stop posting their lunches on Facebook.
Yeah, true. Or humble bragging about their new job on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Well, can we just go back to thinking about, I think this sort of Foucauldian idea that I think you're going to mention in the talk that you're giving to us later today, about thinking of this in terms of an issue of advanced liberal governance or government. Can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, as I understand it, it's a kind of complex balancing act between sort of different forms of regulation or different notions of what a kind of public interest might be, and how that can be balanced with individual interests.
Sure. I think that the evolution of thinking around regulation over the last 40 years has been very, very significant. The development of sort of hybrid models that don't simply point to a black letter law or command and control model has been very much a feature around the globe. Even in places like China, like there would be critics of the Xi Jinping moment for coming down too hard with too many traditional sort of command and control instruments, and whether that's been stifling innovation. So there are hybrid models. In many respects, you'd expect internet governance to be
hybrid.
Be hybrid. It doesn't sit within nation states. It moves. It has the unique feature, not unique, but it's impossible to regulate the internet without the consent of the platforms themselves, unless you do, say, what happens in Ethiopia when someone criticises the government and the plug's pulled on the network. Assuming you're not going down that path, at some level, the companies have the information base, the understanding of the algorithm, etc., that they will need to consent to their own regulation. So that promotes hybridisation, and in many respects, from the point of view of the companies, it's not so much whether they're regulated or not. And there's a couple of very interesting op-eds by Zuckerberg in the Washington Post saying, well, it's not about whether Facebook's going to be regulated or not. It's about how it's going to be regulated, and we want to be leading that conversation. That said, there are real legitimacy questions here, and there are certainly organisations in Australia, for example, a group called Reset, which I believe was founded by McIntyre or McEnroe. He was an investor in Facebook who became a critic of where the company had gone, and they would say the history of non-compliance is such that you can't leave responsibility for social media regulation with the platforms,
with the company.
Yeah, and so there are tensions within that. At the same time, the knowledge base from which a lot of regulators and legislators are working from is highly uneven. We recall when Zuckerberg appeared before the US Congress and he was asked, I said, well, how do you make money on this? He said, well, we sell ads. It was kind of a level of baseline understanding that was very, very different.
Can you just say a little bit about what does Foucault mean by this notion of advanced liberal government or people in that space? I mean, I think is that a term used by Nick Rose?
By Nick Rose and that group, drawing on Donslow. That it's the concept that I think it's the concept that there's a degree of reflexivity around liberal modes of government. That it's a more experimental phase. It recognizes that citizens are actively engaged in the questions around their own governmental practices. That it's not neoliberalism. I mean, I don't really buy the term neoliberalism in some respects, but it's an inflection point within liberalism where there's a greater degree of reflexivity and
Interestingly, on that point, I was thinking that, and actually going back to the conversation I was having with Diane Coyle earlier in the week, so this is a space where the conventional economic categories of like a private good and a public good arguably sort of dissolve. It's not clear what kind of goods these are, and that's where you get this kind of potential for innovation, I guess, in thinking through what form of regulation is appropriate. And I was also thinking, when she was saying that, actually, although I didn't mention it to her, that it's quite close to Eleanor Ostram's idea that there's a space that's beyond markets and states. So you can't actually think of these goods as being normally marketed goods or state-provided goods. They're somewhere in this grey zone, and that actually does mean that you need reflexivity in terms of thinking about how they are actually managed.
Yeah, I think in the early incarnation they were club goods.
Yeah.
So you could form online communities of a certain size, and they could develop their own sort of rules, norms, understandings, and so forth. But because of the imperative to grow the numbers, grow the attention, increase the hits, and so forth, the clubs exploded. So you have the phenomenon of context collapse, which we have all the time on social media. You might.
What's that?
So it's like, let's say you're as an academic in another country, you might be posting about things you're doing, as in your academic work, and then suddenly you discover your old school friends. Are in there, and you want to try and manage.
And you wish you hadn't posted.
Well, Well, they've been fine, but you're trying to manage some quite different relationships, and also you get the for some these are spaces for the robust exchange of ideas. For others that feels like harassment. So you've got all this going on, and people are blocking and etc. But it's not a private good, because the free access, the free access is the condition for being on it. If it became a subscription, if these became subscriber-based platforms rather than advertiser-based platforms, they'd work quite differently. But they're also they're not public goods from the point of view of the platforms administering them. They are running, and primarily advertiser financed commercial businesses, and they want to sort of set limits to the extent to which they're not a kind of BBC of the internet, or
they're not like some kind of public utility or something like that.
No. There's been occasional talk of going along those lines, but it would be difficult. It would be difficult, and would also be within one country.
So, if we think about that concept of advanced liberalism, then is it about sort of groping for what liberalism means in the context of these kind of goods? Would that be the way of thinking about it? Or?
Yeah, I think it is that. And again, the term liberal can have different meanings in different contexts. But yeah, there is a degree of, I think, uncertainty about what exactly we want collectively from these entities. I mean, in the early years, there was much talk about these would be the new Habermasian public sphere, if you like. But for a lot of reasons, it hasn't played out in that way. So what it is that's being collectively sought is both hard to know and hard to gauge. That it's in terms of trust in different types of media. Interestingly, search engines are more trusted than traditional media, and people will use Google to fact check things that they come across in the media. Social media are less trusted than traditional media, and that comes to be a bit of a question about, well, is this, is social media the kind of collective sorcerer's apprentice? I think there was a fascinating moment with the election of Trump in 2016 where the San Francisco Examiner observed that in the city of San Francisco, the Trump-Pence ticket attracted 3% of the vote. Yet, this is where the people live who work for the companies who provided the platforms that enabled this to happen, and through a kind of collective. What did we do? What was happening? What was happening here? And it's something that's different to, say in the UK media, you have a tradition of there being liberal publications and more conservative publications that that the Telegraph will take one view and the Guardian will take another, and that's kind of understood. But they're spaces that aren't defined in that way, but they're also not neutral.
Well, my own experience of it is that I feel quite disorientated by this world in a way, because I remember when I first started using Facebook or some of these, I don't use many of the platforms, but it was a kind of naive experience, almost as though initially it was about connecting with people that I hadn't seen in years, and then you start putting things on about work. But then suddenly, especially the last 5 years or so, it feels like this kind of ultra-politicized space as well, which it didn't feel like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. That seems to have sort of happened over time, maybe as politicians realised that people used this is a way of reaching them. You sort of started to get all kinds of...
I think politicians have actually been behind where the drivers of this, and I think it's been most marked with Twitter. And Twitter has, there's certain dynamics to Twitter, which has about 300 million users, and which has not really grown that much over time, but it has a hyper engaged core. So classic power law of distribution, 10% of Twitter users account for 90% of posts. And they live this vicariously. So and also I think it intersects with other media in the sense that people say, well, Twitter reacted to blah blah.
And the news media, like the television media, report things that were
That's-
reported on Twitter.
That's right, and we're talking about a user base that in Australia would be about 6% of the population, roughly the same as the user base of Reddit. But you'd never hear Reddit talked about as an opinion shaping medium. Maybe it is. People just don't research it as much as Twitter. But this idea and this idea that you can kind of win and winning battles on Twitter, and this sort of hypervigilance has come to be one of the I think less attractive features of the platform. Not least because you just can't you can't have an effective argument within the space of character that's there. So
I don't use it.
No. It's easy to walk away from its current form.
Okay, Terry. So, where do you think, just to sort of finish up the conversation here, where do you think, maybe this is unfair given what we've been saying about how maybe unpredictable some of these developments are, but where do you see the governance of these platforms going in the next 5 to 10 years? What do you see as being the major, most likely trends that are happening?
I think we're going to see the relationship between two things. One is that we'll see nation states wanting to take action here, although I do note in the UK that the online safety bill seems to have been battered back and forth for quite a while.
Yeah.
Quite a while now. But say the EU's initiatives in this area, certainly in the US, the Biden administration, it takes a very different perspective to its predecessors in the Obama or going back to Clinton administrations on the paratech platforms. So you'll have various measures being floated around there. I think you'll also have companies looking to offer their own solutions, and that's where I think the oversight board is an interesting thing to monitor. But then you may they're not all the same thing. In that respect, I think I'd rather be Google than Facebook at the moment, because I think search has classic network effect characteristics, whereas social media I'm less sure that it does, or maybe it's peaked. Maybe.
So is it there that the social media is actually closer to the club good that you were talking about before, in the sense that basically there are different clubs that people want to be members of?
Well, it certainly lends itself to setting up an alternative. Yeah, I think. Yeah. And given that you can be relatively profitable on a smaller base than 2.7 billion. Yeah. It lends itself to other options. I think we'll be following that. And so in that respect, I think dare I say it, Facebook's rebrand as Meta signals the company itself may go into something quite different. So I think in that respect, I'd see social media space as actually very fluid.
Okay, so what's next for you? What are you working on at the moment? What's the next project?
Oh, well, we concluded a project on platform regulation, and in fact, that was the initial pitch was at Somerset House back in 2018 when Mark Zuckerberg appeared before the US Congress. So it wasn't a hard pitch to write a book on platform regulation and to win over a publisher with that. At the moment, looking at the value of news and the relationship between news publishers and digital platforms, that's an area, and that's one where there's a lot of new measures coming through in different jurisdictions. Perhaps a variant of what we've been talking about, since the issues also connect to misinformation.
I was going to say there's a lot of debates in this country increasingly about what is issues about bias in news or different providers of news, that sort of thing, and in some ways it does mirror this debate about the information that's provided on the platforms. Yeah.
So aside from the question of whether the platforms have an obligation to pay the news publishers for use of their content. There's also the question of the wider information ecosystem, and I think probably the needle and centrifugal tendencies that, one of the features of news is that we partly seek out news for information, but we also partly seek out news for affirmation. And this means that there is a business strategy in giving people the news that they think they want to hear. But the voice inside our heads tells us that there's problems with that when applied on a society-wide scale. So there's also the question of trusted sources going on in parallel to that.
So have you got a book? Is there a book project coming on that? Or?
There may be. Yeah. We have an Australian Research Council funded project and are talking to platforms, media analysts, media companies.
Okay, excellent. That sounds great. Well, maybe we can talk about that in the future. But as for now, thank you very much. It's been very good to talk to you, Professor Terry Plew.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.